March 14, 1931. A rivet flies through the air and misses its target. The man who was supposed to catch it does not. He loses his footing. He falls. 400 feet. No net, no warning, no pause. Work does not stop. The foreman marks a number in a ledger. The rivet gang moves on. Because in 1931, in the middle of the greatest economic collapse America had ever seen, a dead worker was a line in a book. Not a headline, not a tragedy. Just the cost of building something impossible. Most people think the Empire State Building is a story of American greatness, a symbol of ambition, a triumph of engineering. They are wrong. It is a monument soaked in desperation, built by men who had no choice, driven by a man who was racing against his own financial ruin, and finished at a speed that should have been physically impossible. What happened on that construction site between 1930 and 1931 has been sanitized, minimized, and buried. This is the version they never put in the history books. To understand what was about to be built, you first need to understand what had just been destroyed. On October 24, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. Within 48 hours, billions of dollars had evaporated, banks failed, businesses shuttered. By the end of 1930, over 4 million Americans were unemployed. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Men who had owned factories were selling apples on street corners. Families who had lived in comfortable homes were sleeping in parks. The richest country on earth had become, almost overnight, a place where survival itself was uncertain. Into this wreckage walked John Jacob Raskob, a financier, a former executive at General Motors, a man who had made and lost enormous fortunes and was determined to make another. His plan was audacious to the point of madness. He would build the tallest skyscraper in the world, in the middle of a depression, on a timeline that gave his construction team roughly 410 days. He would call it the Empire State Building. But Raskob was not building out of civic pride. He was not building to inspire a broken nation. He was building because he was desperate. His investments had collapsed. His reputation had taken severe damage. He needed a spectacle so enormous, so undeniable, so magnificent that the world would forget his recent failures and see only the monument he had created. The Empire State Building was not a gift to New York. It was a calculated act of financial self-preservation, dressed up as architectural ambition. The site he chose had once held the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel, one of the most prestigious addresses in New York. It was demolished in 1929 to make way for whatever Raskob had in mind. When construction began, nobody in the city fully understood the scale of what was coming. The blueprints called for a building of 102 floors, rising 1,250 feet above street level. At the time, nothing like it had ever been attempted. There was only one problem. The Chrysler Building was already going up 2 blocks away, and Walter Chrysler had publicly announced his intention to build the tallest skyscraper in the world. The race had already started before Raskob had broken ground, and Raskob was already behind. The man hired to design and oversee the Empire State Building was William Lamb of the firm Shreve, Lamb and Harmon. Lamb received his instructions directly from Raskob. The brief was simple and terrifying in equal measure. How tall can you make it? How fast can you build it, and how little can it cost? Lamb designed the building in just 2 weeks. 2 weeks for a structure that would require 60,000 tons of steel, over 10 million bricks, 7 miles of elevator shafts, and enough limestone to fill a small quarry. 2 weeks, because there was no time for anything more. The schedule demanded that design and construction begin almost simultaneously, with architectural details being finalized even as the foundation was being dug. Construction officially began on March 17, 1930. The pace was immediately unlike anything the construction industry had witnessed. At the peak of the project, over 3,500 workers were on site at any given moment, 7 days a week, before sunrise until after dark. Concrete was poured, steel was bolted and riveted, floors were framed, and the whole enormous machine moved upward at an average of 4.5 floors per week. To feed this operation, the logistics alone were staggering. Steel beams were fabricated in Pittsburgh, loaded onto trains, and delivered to Manhattan on a scheduled time to the hour. There was no room on the construction lot to store materials. Everything that arrived had to be used almost immediately. Trucks offloaded directly onto lifts. Lifts carried beams to the floor under construction. Workers grabbed them and riveted them into place before the next load arrived. The entire process was a choreography of industrial precision that left almost no margin for error. And yet errors happened. They happened constantly. Loads shifted and fell. Equipment malfunctioned under the strain of continuous use. Workers on lower floors had to dodge debris falling from upper floors where construction was moving faster. The communication between different teams was done by shouting, by hand signals, and by a system of pneumatic tubes that carried written notes between floors. In the noise and chaos of a construction site of this magnitude, misunderstandings were inevitable. And misunderstandings at 400 feet above street level carried consequences that no foreman could undo. The men doing this work were not protected by anything resembling modern safety standards. There were no harnesses. There were no mandatory hard hats in 1930. There were no safety nets strung beneath the open steel frame. Workers on the highest beams were separated from the street below by nothing except their own sense of balance and their refusal to look down. The Mohawk iron workers, who made up a significant portion of the high steel crews, were renowned for their ability to walk narrow beams at extreme heights without apparent fear. But even among them, accidents happened. And when they did, the consequences were final. The rivet gangs worked in teams of 4. One man heated the rivet in a coal-fired bucket until it glowed orange. He threw it with tongs to a second man positioned nearby, who caught it in a metal cone. A third man held it in place against the steel. A fourth man drove it home with a pneumatic hammer. This process happened hundreds of times per day, at every level of the building, with molten metal flying through open air, across distances of 10 and 20 feet. A missed catch meant a glowing rivet falling toward the workers in street below. It happened more than the official records acknowledge. The official death count released by the construction company and accepted by the city of New York was 5 workers. 5. That number has been cited in textbooks, documentaries, and official histories for decades. It is almost certainly wrong. Contemporary reporting in New York newspapers during the construction period documented at least 14 deaths on or directly connected to the construction site. Researchers who have since examined hospital records, insurance company claims, and the coroner's office records from the relevant period have found evidence suggesting the real number was significantly higher. Some estimates place the true death toll at over 100 workers when accounting for those who died from injuries sustained on site, but passed away days or weeks later. Those whose deaths were attributed to other causes by employers eager to avoid liability, and those whose names simply vanished from payroll records without explanation. The reason the number remains uncertain is deliberate. In 1930 and 1931, no federal law required construction companies to report worker deaths or injuries to any government agency. The construction company was under no obligation to keep comprehensive records. And even when deaths were recorded, the language used in official documents was often vague enough to obscure the true cause. A worker who fell from a beam and survived for 3 days before dying in a hospital might be listed as having died of internal injuries, with no reference to the construction site at all. This was not an accident. It was a system designed to protect the companies and ignore the workers. And it worked exactly as intended for nearly a century. There is a photograph taken in 1932, 1 year after the Empire State Building was completed, that has become one of the most reproduced images of the 20th century. 11 construction workers sit on a steel beam suspended hundreds of feet above Midtown Manhattan, eating their lunch. Their legs hang over the edge. Their feet dangle above nothing. Below them, the streets of New York stretch away in every direction. The buildings impossibly small, the people invisible. Not one of the 11 men is wearing any form of safety equipment. There are no ropes, no harnesses, no barriers of any kind between them and a fall that would kill every single one of them instantly. The photograph is called Lunch Atop a Skyscraper. It has appeared on posters, postcards, coffee mugs, and gallery walls around the world for decades. People look at it and feel a thrill, a sense of vertigo mixed with admiration. What most people never stop to consider is that for the men in that photograph, this was not a daring moment. This was Tuesday. This was lunch. This was the completely ordinary reality of what it meant to build the tallest building in the world in 1931. Those men did not choose to sit on that beam as an act of bravado. They sat there because there was nowhere else to sit. The building had no break room at that height, no cafeteria, no shelter of any kind. You ate where you worked, and where you worked was in open air, on steel beams, over a city that looked like a model from where you sat. Every day, for 410 days, the physical conditions on the construction site were brutal in ways that go beyond the obvious dangers of height. In the summer of 1930, the steel beams absorbed heat from the sun until they were too hot to touch with bare hands. Workers wrapped rags around their tools to avoid burning their palms. The temperature on the upper floors, exposed to direct sun with no shade of any kind, regularly exceeded 100 degrees. Men working the rivet guns stood next to open coal fires in that heat. The combination of physical exertion, extreme temperature, and dehydration killed workers in ways that never appeared in any accident report. They simply collapsed. They were carried down, and the work continued. In winter, the same steel that had burned in summer became a conductor of cold so intense that metal tools froze to unprotected skin. Workers who touched a beam without gloves found their hands sticking to the surface. Ice formed on the upper floors overnight and had to be chipped away before work could resume each morning. Men worked in conditions that no modern safety regulation would permit for a single hour. They worked in those conditions for months, and through all of it, the pressure from above never relented. The project managers and financial backers of the Empire State Building had one overriding priority: speed. Not safety, not the welfare of the workforce. Speed. Because every day the building was not finished was a day the loans were accruing interest that Raskop could not afford. Every delay was money bleeding from a project that was already operating on margins thin enough to be terrifying. The workers understood this. They understood that they were expendable. They understood that if one of them refused an assignment, or raised a concern about a dangerous condition, or simply moved too slowly, there were 10 men waiting at the gate who would take his place without complaint. The Great Depression had created a labor market where human beings competed for the privilege of working in dangerous conditions for wages that barely covered survival. The men who built the Empire State Building were not heroes in the eyes of the men who employed them. They were units of production, replaceable, interchangeable, and temporary. The engineering challenges they were asked to overcome were not hypothetical. They were immediate, concrete, and in some cases, genuinely unprecedented. No building of this height had ever been constructed this quickly. The engineering principles that governed the structural behavior of a steel frame at this scale, under dynamic loads, wind forces, and thermal expansion, had never been tested at anything close to this magnitude. The architects and engineers were making calculations that had never been made before, and making them under time pressure that allowed for almost no margin of error. The wind loads alone presented a challenge that kept the structural engineers working around the clock. A building of 1,250 feet does not stand still in the wind. It sways. This is not a flaw. It is a design feature. A rigid skyscraper that refused to flex under wind pressure would crack and fail. The Empire State Building was designed to sway up to 1 inch at the top in high winds, but calculating exactly how much sway was safe and how to build a steel frame that would flex without failing required engineering work that pushed the boundaries of what was known at the time. The foundation presented a different kind of problem. Manhattan bedrock is not uniform. In some areas, it sits close to the surface, providing an ideal base for a heavy structure. In others, it drops away to depths that require extensive and expensive pile driving to reach stable ground. The Empire State Building's foundation required the removal of enormous quantities of earth and rock to reach bedrock at a depth sufficient to support the weight of what would be built above it. This work proceeded simultaneously with the demolition of the existing structure on the site, creating a chaos of excavation, debris removal, and incoming construction materials that had to be managed with military precision simply to keep the site from grinding to a halt. The curtain wall of limestone and granite that covers the exterior of the building required its own separate supply chain. The stone was quarried in Indiana, cut to specification, loaded onto trains, and delivered to Manhattan, where it was lifted floor by floor and fitted into place by workers who had to match each piece precisely to its neighbors with tolerances measured in fractions of an inch. All of this was happening on the exterior of the building while the interior floors above were still raw steel. The building was, at any given moment, simultaneously at 3 or 4 different stages of completion at different heights. By the time the steel frame reached its full height in late 1930, the building that had been designed in 2 weeks had become something that its own architect had not fully anticipated. The sheer scale of it, visible from miles away, rising above everything else in the Manhattan skyline, had a psychological effect on the city that was difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. New Yorkers who had watched it rise day by day suddenly realized when the frame was complete that something genuinely new had appeared in their world. Something that had not existed before and could not be unseen. But Raskob's problems were not over. They were, in many ways, just beginning. The building opened on May 1st, 1931, with a ceremony attended by dignitaries from across the country. President Herbert Hoover pressed a button in Washington that activated the building's lights from hundreds of miles away. The newspapers celebrated. The crowds gathered. The observation deck was open to the public and immediately became one of the most visited attractions in New York. And the office floors sat empty. The Great Depression had not ended. The businesses that Raskob had assumed would rush to lease space in the world's most prestigious address were fighting for survival. They were laying off workers, not leasing office towers. The economics that had made the Empire State Building seem like a sure investment in 1929 had been destroyed by the same collapse that had made building it seem necessary. New Yorkers began calling it the empty State Building. The joke was cruel and accurate. For years, the building's operating costs exceeded its rental income. The observation deck and the antenna lease were all that kept the lights on. Raskob would not see a genuine profit from the building until the 1950s. The monument he had built to save his reputation and restore his fortune had come within a narrow margin of destroying both. He had won the race against the Chrysler Building. He had built the tallest structure in the world, and he had done it at a human cost that no official document was willing to honestly record. The mooring mast at the top of the building has its own story. Raskob's original stated intention was that the mast would serve as a docking point for transatlantic dirigible airships. The hydrogen-filled giants that were then crossing the Atlantic on scheduled routes would tie up at the top of the Empire State Building, and their passengers would walk a gangplank over the Manhattan skyline and descend by elevator into the city. The mast was built. The cables were installed. Airships did briefly attempt to approach it on several occasions, and on at least one instance a small unmanned airship was briefly tethered to demonstrate the concept, but it never worked as intended. The wind at that altitude, channeled and amplified by the surrounding buildings and the thermal dynamics of the city below, made sustained docking impossible. The airship companies evaluated the risk and declined to attempt regular service. The whole enterprise was quietly abandoned and the mast was repurposed for broadcast antennas, which is what it remains to this day. Whether Raskob ever genuinely believed the dirigible plan was viable, or whether it was conceived from the beginning as a means of adding 200 feet of height to beat the Chrysler Building while providing a plausible public justification, is a question that historians have debated ever since. The answer has never been definitively established. The documents that might resolve it, if they ever existed in explicit form, have not surfaced. It remains one of the quiet mysteries buried inside the larger story of how the building came to be. On May 1st, 1931, 410 days after the first steel was set, the Empire State Building was declared complete. It held the record as the tallest building in the world for 40 years. It survived a direct impact from a United States Army Air Forces bomber in 1945, when a B-25 Mitchell aircraft, disoriented in heavy fog, flew into the north side of the building between the 78th and 79th floors, killing 14 people and causing a fire that was brought under control within 40 minutes. The building was open for business the following Monday. It has withstood 8 decades of Manhattan winters, countless storms, the September 11th attacks that destroyed the towers it had once dominated, and the slow transformation of the skyline around it, from something it commanded into something it merely inhabits. It is no longer the tallest building in New York. It is no longer the tallest building in America. It is no longer one of the tallest buildings in the world. But it is still the one people mean when they say skyscraper. Walk past it today. Look up at the limestone facing that the workers fitted stone by stone in the winter of 1930. Look at the steel frame beneath it that the rivet gangs assembled at 4.5 floors per week. Think about the men who stood on those beams without harnesses, eating lunch with their legs dangling over the city, because there was nowhere else to sit. Their names are not on the building. There is no memorial to them in the lobby. The plaques and the exhibits and the guided tours do not dwell on the question of how many of them died to make the thing that tourists photograph every day. The official answer is 5. The honest answer is that nobody knows. And the reason nobody knows is that nobody in a position of authority in 1930 and 1931 thought it was important enough to find out. 410 days, 60,000 tons of steel, 7 miles of elevator shafts, 10 million bricks, and a number of human lives that the building has kept secret for nearly a century. That is the true foundation of the Empire State Building, not the bedrock beneath 34th Street. The men who fell and were not counted and were not mourned and were not remembered. They built the impossible, and the impossible forgot them.